All right, welcome to another video of Mr. Bouchard's IB history class. Today, impact of World War I on Canada. So, post-war Canada. Effect on foreign affairs is one of the first things we're going to look at. Not just foreign affairs, but to look at the fact that Canada becomes an independent nation in its foreign affairs. To a point, to a great extent. Political and economic effects of the war, how the post-war, and then how it sets up Canada for later. Social effects, including the repatriating and integrating of troops back into society. Our key question here is, to what extent did Canada's involvement in the First World War create a Canadian nationhood and identity? And how much does the time in with World War I really make a difference? So, impact on foreign policy. The first big step is that they represented themselves at the Treaty of Versailles. Borden, the Dominions, led by Borden, fought for and won the right to a separate signature to the peace treaties. They signed it themselves. Borden also took the step. One of the things that Article 10 came up again. Borden, like the U.S., disliked Article 10 for many of the same reasons the U.S. did. They shared the distrust of European entanglements that the U.S. did. And in many ways, the post-war experience of Canada resembles that of the United States rather than that of England. And you might say, ask why? And the question, or the reason is because of Canada's geography. Canada is an ocean away and really kind of embraces this idea of isolationism. Now, given the airplane, given all the new technology that's coming up, isolationism really is a myth. Given the fact that they are both global economies, the United States and Canada, isolationism really is not necessarily something that they can actually achieve, although they try. So Borden pushes to sign the treaty and wanted the Canadian Parliament to approve the treaty, which at this point in time was not needed. Once Britain signed it, so did the Dominions. But by pushing this, I think what Borden is really trying to push forward is saying that we are an independent nation, and trying to communicate that to Britain, trying to communicate that to themselves. So, despite objecting to Article 10, Borden wants to join the League of Nations. May I be permitted to add that in the Association of Mutual Insurance Against Fire, that the risks we face are not all equal. We, Canada, live in a fireproof house far from inflammable materials. A vast ocean separates us from Europe. So you can see that same attitude that the irreconcilables and other reservationists had within the United States, that we are not in Europe, and so why should we be submitted to European entanglements? As you can see here, this is a painting or representation of the time when everyone is signing. Excuse me. Signing the Treaty of Versailles. That's Woodrow Wilson, Clemenceau, the main people, and Canada obviously is not at the main table, but is still pushing for a seat in the League of Nations. Now, Borden pushed for this, but Britain wanted it. Britain wanted Canada to have a seat in the League of Nations because they assumed that Canada would vote with them, and that would give them an extra vote. Britain wanted a counterbalance to the U.S. Canada refuses just to side with Britain, and Borden communicates that to Britain and the United States through letters, saying itself a link between the two countries. The United States actually was one to refuse the link between the two, did not want Canada to have its own seat because they figured they would just vote with Great Britain. And you can see that as part of the debate. They thought that the Dominions would all vote with Great Britain, and that would give Great Britain 5 or 6 votes rather than just 1. That wasn't the case, but that was the fear. As you can see here, this is the British Empire. Okay, and here we see the different premiers and leaders of the different provinces. So King and the move towards independence. King did go to a lot of the, as you can see here, conferences. Went to the empire conferences where they talked about trade and protection and military. But King really took a different stance. Now you might ask, who is Mackenzie King? Well, Borden and Mahan decided Canada would work within the British Empire framework. Arthur Mahan took over for Borden when Borden's health failed, and he got really sick and he resigned. And so Mahan, being the second person, just assumes the prime ministership. But he loses the election of 1920, and the reason he loses this is because he was a conscriptionist, a staunch imperialist and a staunch conscriptionist, and this alienated many in Quebec, giving King that block of Quebec votes, but also a lot of votes from the West. And so King, the Liberal leader, takes over. And Mackenzie King is somebody who we will talk about a lot because he led Canada both through the end of World War I and then all the way through World War II. And King took a cautious approach to Canada's foreign policy. He did not necessarily engage too much in the imperial conferences and tried to almost distance himself from Great Britain. The goal for Mackenzie King was to achieve nationhood. And so there's several instances or several little pieces that we're going to talk about here that show or lead to Canada's independence. The Shannak Crisis in 1922. Britain had signed a treaty with Turkey, and that Turkey, with that treaty, gave there was a demilitarized zone where Allied troops were towards the coast. Turkey felt like they had to sign this treaty, but wanted that territory, and so they marched their troops and basically backed Britain into a corner. Britain, realizing a fight might happen, goes to the Dominions and asks for troops. Mackenzie King just replied very quickly with only Parliament can decide whether to send troops, and Parliament was not in session. Now, Mackenzie King could have sent troops in an emergency. He could have dealt with or called Parliament to a special section, but basically refuses. Once Britain signs the Treaty of Lausanne with Turkey, King basically prompted King to say that Canada does not have to abide by that treaty because we were not part of the conflict. Then comes a treaty over fishing rights. And this is actually in 1925. And this treaty basically is about fishing rights. It was argued in 1923, but was officially signed and put forth in 1925. And this was just fishing rights both on the eastern and western coasts. Just which waters can be fished by Canadian fishermen, which one can be fished by U.S. It's a minor treaty. It's not significant at all. However, the significance is in who signs it. This was followed by Canada sending Vincent Massey, the first Canadian. So basically, Canada signed it, and the U.S. signed it, and they considered it a treaty. They never ran it by the British, which was the first time ever that the British hasn't signed treaties. Now, Canada has been negotiating its own treaties, and so it's just kind of a rubber stamp or just a formal that Britain signs it. And this time, Canada or Mackenzie King orders it not to be sent. And the U.S. takes this as a sign as that it is time to go ahead and just deal with Canada. So the U.S. opened a legation, basically an embassy in Ottawa, and other countries followed suit, recognizing Canadian autonomy. And Canada sent Vincent Massey, the first Canadian appointed foreign minister to the United States. So basically, the Halibut Treaty is not significant, but the effects of the treaty are. And so the Turkish crisis, or the Shannak crisis, King refuses to follow suit, and then says we are not obliged to that treaty. The Halibut Treaty basically shows that they are no longer going to have the British sign it, and that they begin to have foreign relations with other countries. So this brings us to the Balfour Report. Basically, the Balfour Report, Balfour was the foreign minister of Great Britain in 1926, and he recommended that British dominions be autonomous communities within the British Empire, equal status and in no way subordinate to one another in any aspect of their domestic or external affairs. Basically saying we need to be equal, and we should create what he calls the Commonwealth of Nations. This is basically like the Thanksgiving table. You start out at the kids' table, and then you move up to the adult table, but you're still a teenager, and you get into conversations, but you know that basically you didn't help put any of the food on the table, or maybe you helped prepare it, but you didn't pay for it most of the time. And so what happens is you've got a situation where you are part of the table, you're part of the family, but the parents are still in charge. Well, what happens later on is you go out, you get a family, you have a job, you come back, and the table is still there, and this is what the Commonwealth of Nations is, and the parents are still at the head of the table, but it is a table of equals. And so that is basically what the Commonwealth of Nations is that Thanksgiving table of equals. So in 1928, British sent a high commissioner to facilitate relations between Great Britain and its dominions, and basically come up with what's called the Declaration of Westminster. It's the formal document to make the dominions like grown children in a family. They still honor their parents as the leader, but they are no longer dependent on their parents, but more of a form of more of a friendship. And so the Statute of Westminster, 1931, or the Westminster Treaty, creates the Commonwealth of Nations and gives Canada its freedom. I love this cartoon. Just as big as Daddy. Equal status. So maybe equal status, but not necessarily equal in its economy, in its military, in its political structure. The Statute of Westminster, 1931, creates the Commonwealth of Nations. And basically, Canada joins the United States in isolationism. The naval treaty with Japan, United States, Great Britain, and France. Canada also signs it, as Canada is a growing navy. And they worked with, or were part of this treaty as a Commonwealth nation. So the economic impact. Canada is the fastest growing economy from 1896 until 1914, when they go into a slight recession. They had 350% growth in individuals working in industry during the war. Now, short-term economic effects of the war, you see a dismantling. Wartime controls discontinued the wheat board, even though most farmers wanted the wheat board. They discontinued the Imperial Munitions Board. And sold off many of the factories. And so the government just jumped out of the economy, which had some short-term effects that were negative. 60% inflation, meaning that money became worth less and less. And a recession that hit the farmers is the worst, as prices fell throughout the 1920s. And although business leaders and business workers come back, the agriculture never quite fully recovers. There's high unemployment right after the war. In the long term, however, the war years were not so much a period of transition as a violent interlude that greatly accelerated the inevitable transformation of the economy. McGuinness is a Canadian historian with a Scottish name, and he basically is saying that the war was a violent transition, especially economically. But what he's arguing is that it only accelerated the inevitable, whereas some people would say that World War I changed the course of Canada. So those are two perspectives. War gave rise to the industrial boom of the 20s. Ottawa catered to big business, tax breaks, tightening credit, and high tariffs, which angered the farmers. chartered banks, credit halt spurred a recession. Farmers were decimated because of the credit. Farmers are their whole growth is based on credit, their whole economy. So they borrow money for seed, then they plant the seed, then they borrow money for fertilizer, and to be able to get through, then they sell the crop and they pay their debt back, and then they borrow more money. And so it's kind of a cycle where farmers constantly need credit, but credit was tightened by the government. Now, we can also see from what we talked about earlier, just the amount of growth within the industry, and the industrial base of Canada grows quite a bit. And so they go from kind of a young economy to more of an adolescent economy with a huge growth of industry. And so that's one of the biggest effects of World War I, is that just tremendous growth in industry that continues to grow through the 20s. But there were some negative effects as well. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about right now. And that's the Westminster strike. So this was a general strike in the city at 11 a.m. Today, as you can see here. Basically, the Winnipeg General Strike, 1918, 1919. We're going to watch a video on this when we get to class, but I want to talk about it as well. This strike went on for 16 weeks. It started with some factory workers, and they wanted to raise price and gain the rate to collectively bargain. And 35,000 workers went on strike, basically stopping Winnipeg. Now, general strikes happened from Vancouver to Nova Scotia. Winnipeg civic leaders were convinced that this was a communist plot to turn Canada into a communist nation. Now, whether they truly believe that, or they use that as a way of repressing workers, because a lot of those business leaders, civic leaders, are business owners. And it's in their interest to squash the strikes before they happen. At the same time, there is a fear of communism because of the central strike of Petrograd right here, if you see that. And that led to the communist revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, which is the communist revolution in Russia. And so basically they're looking at that, looking at this, and putting two and two together. And they send the mounted police, who then charge into the crowd, fire into the crowd, and workers are... so basically what happens before we get to the charging in the crowd, the strike leaders were arrested and put in jail. And so there was a peaceful march on the city hall. But when they got to the city hall, the redcoats were lined up. When they refused to disperse, the redcoats charged into the crowd, firing off their weapons and killing some workers. One big union, dreams fell apart, and this idea, one of the dreams that the labor had in Canada, and labor meaning the workers, wanted one big union, one union in Canada where all the workers would collectively bargain through, and would give the workers a lot of clout, a lot of power, because if they were all organized, then business leaders would have to deal with them as one big union rather than one small one. But with the kind of failure of the general strikes to bring any kind of conclusion, management basically took away and wiped out this dream of a big union. The Robeson Commission on the strikes, basically the Mackenzie King appointed this commission to look into the strike and see if it really was about the goals of collective bargaining, higher wages, and social justice, or was it about communism? And its methods have been nonviolent. Leaders of the strike were tried and sent to prison, but the Robeson Commission came through and said no, that it really was about higher wages. It was about these goals that they wanted to, and that the reaction to the strike was too much. And that leads to the union, or some people in Winnipeg the workers getting what they wanted, and it shows that perhaps maybe the communist rhetoric and saying that this was a communist plot to overturn a communist revolution in Canada was more of a ploy to be able to suppress the workers. Reaction to strikes, repressive action in 1918. So the Red Scare is something we have to talk about a little bit. And the Red Scare, and this is going to be a longer video, so I do apologize for that, but the Red Scare is this idea of fear of communism, and fear that Canada is going to become a communist nation because of what happened in Russia. So in 1918, the Industrial Workers of the World, which was a union that was involved in the strike in Winnipeg, was involved in the general strike in Seattle, and 13 other socialist and anarchist groups were declared illegal. You couldn't believe in socialism or communism, which communism is the idea that everyone is equal, will receive equal wages, equal housing, equal everything, and that the society will become more equal, based on the idea that we all work together and we work for the common good, and then we all benefit from that instead of having the rich and the poor. And so communism, or there were people that believed in that idea, and Canada makes it illegal to have those thoughts, which definitely does not seem like something that you can do in a free nation. Immigrant officials deported the IWW members, and basically, when they were arrested, they would deport them to Russia. Orders in Council in 1919 banned publications, basically newspapers, using any of these languages, because these were languages, or these people from Eastern Europe tended, or there were a lot of people from Eastern Europe that tended to have anarchist or socialist views where they believed everybody should be treated equal and workers should have the means of production, meaning the workers should own the factory, not some businessman. And so they banned the use of these languages. And this was basically because of fear. Fear of enemy alien subversion, meaning these enemy aliens or any aliens would work to subvert Canadian culture, and basically this fear of the Bolshevik menace, that once somebody's a communist, or once communism floods Russia, it will flood Europe, and then it will flood Canada, and everybody will become a communist. So remember, rule number 3 in history is if you don't like somebody, you just call them a communist. Restricting immigration, amendments to 1906 Immigration Act. Basically, this was one of the ways that Canada basically dealt with this idea of communism, is they restricted immigration. So denying entry, they deported anyone that had chronic alcoholism or illiteracy. They also just wouldn't let anyone in with any of those ideas. Section 38 allowed the cabinet to prohibit any race, nationality, or class of immigrants by reason of economic, industrial, or other condition temporarily existing in Canada. Unemployment was then high because of their unsuitability or because of their peculiar habits, modes of life, and methods of holding property. Basically, the Canadian government can restrict you if they don't like you. And so, but one of the problems was British-born activists and the Winnipeg General Strike. Most everybody that was involved in the Winnipeg General Strike were British-born, and the British-born were subject to deportation on political grounds, were not subject to deportation. And so, although they're banning all these other languages, it was really British and Canadian-born activists that were responsible for the strike. This particular amendment was appealed in 1928 after the previous efforts had failed before, and so they took away Section 38, allowing more people into the country. Political impact. The war initially unites and led Canada to ultimate independence in 1931. However, we have to talk about the French language issue and the conscription crisis in the election of 1917. There was a division of the French and the English. And so we can say that, yes, Vimy Ridge might have united Canada, but did the conscription crisis and the move towards conscription tear it apart? Can you really say that you have a new Canadian identity when there is really a backlash in Quebec, and the French begin to pull out of Canada, and almost a province, a nation within a nation. They really pull back and don't trust the English-speaking Canadians, and they force a lot of French to go to Quebec, to live in Quebec, because they don't have their schools in other places. Labor and farmers formed political parties. Basically, labor and farmers were also upset about conscription. They were upset about the fact that they felt like the government was supporting big business through tariffs, because farmers don't like tariffs, because that means that they have to pay higher prices for their tractors and for their clothing and for their goods. And that also the government was encouraging strict credit, and it was hard to get credit, high interest rates, and all of these things work against farmers. The government also disbanded the wheat board, and so farmers, because of conscription, because of the actions that they deem where the government has gone against them, because they feel like the government is working against them, they form their own political party. And this is a time where you could see a change in Canada, where basically you form political parties based on your local and your needs, and then you run on that and try and bring that. So there was a division, I think, between labor and farmers and business owners. King and the Liberals win in 1920 because of the push here to move to get these people in power. Is King becomes in power because of the division that was in Canadian society, not the unity. Labor and farmers formed political parties, felt government. So here it is, the stuff that I just talked about. And so they formed what's called the Progressive Party, and labor becomes a part of this as well. Now, they weren't necessarily successful, but they were in both the provinces and the dominions. And so they worked to try and help, but worked together. But because they were not united, they basically told everybody to vote for their own individual needs, their own individual wants. And that really kind of sets Canada's national politics for the first time, becomes driven by local needs. Movements of political protests, the Maritimes upset about being marginalized by people, movement in high freight prices, they also protest. And basically, Mackenzie King, when he felt like he needed the election, put together a commission, and they lowered the freight prices for the Maritimes, but that still didn't change the fact that people were moving out of them, and they were becoming less and less of a power in Canada, whereas the western provinces were gaining more population. Basically, so the veteran issue, dominions and provinces cooperated on a program for veterans. It was called the Empire Settlement Act of 1922. Brought 130,000 British immigrants, including many non-ex-soldiers, to Canada. Less than 10% of the newcomers actually became farmers, which is what they were supposed to. They were supposed to get land, and they were supposed to be able to do that. Canada gives their soldiers a veteran pension, but the problem with that is that it becomes almost 20% of the federal budget. And so when you're talking about federal budget, you're talking about the nation's money. 20% of that money was just going to veteran pensions. However, Canada did a much better job of taking care of its veterans than a lot of other countries. They established the Khaki University in 1917, and the Khaki University basically was pre-university classes, so pre-college classes, basically for people who didn't finish high school or needed further education so that they would be prepared to go to college. Over 50,000 Canadian soldiers took advantage of this, and many of them went on to college. The more workers you have go to college, the better, more educated your workforce is, the better they tend to be and more productive. Department of Soldiers Reestablishment provided vocational training to other soldiers, and over 30,000 took advantage of this program as Great Britain really tried to work and get more of its soldiers through and part of the society. Then you have the Soldiers Settlement Board that was really to help soldiers become farmers. 40,000 become part of this, but by 1921, only 25,000 actually remain farmers. Part of that was because some of the struggles that farmers had with prices and things like that, but also because the Soldiers Settlement Board bought land that really wasn't that good for farming and growing wheat. And so because they bought bad farmland, many of those farmers weren't able to continue doing what they did. And so there was some successes and some failures here. You can see, though, that there was an attempt to really work with the soldiers. So we will talk about the rest of the social developments in class, because this video has gone on long enough, and I'm sure you're tired of listening to me. So remember, or take a really good look. Let's actually jump ahead. And we will look at all of this later, but let's jump ahead and just look at perspectives. 1. World War I created unity and a national identity through the common struggle to make an impact on the war, and basically brought about independence. Whereas language issues and Borden's broken promise leaves the French Canadians isolated, farmers isolated, labor isolated, and divided the nation. And so, yes, they became independent, but they were a divided nation because of their participation in World War I. All right. Thank you, and I hope that you get a lot out of this video.